Lord, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, you who are our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. So this past week, I spent a few days of the Thanksgiving holiday with my mom's extended family. And because my mom and all her siblings and some of her cousins all grew up as preachers' children, I thought I had a nice opportunity to crowdsource some ideas for this very classic story of Jesus healing 10 lepers, but receiving thanks from only the one. So I thought it was interesting that 3 aunts and uncles and 2 cousins all shared the same conclusion. They said that the problem was the other 9 lepers were just so overjoyed by this miraculous healing that gratitude slipped their minds because they were in such a rush to finally resume their normal lives and do all of the things that they had dreamed of while living as outcasts, as lepers. Anticipation had built for so long that when this moment that they had waited for finally arrived, stopping to thank the giver of this life-changing gift was just not top of mind. And it's relatable because we know there's nothing quite like the euphoria of the moment that you finally get something long awaited. As the Advent season begins, I imagine all of the children who are anticipating a very specific gift this Christmas, and in that frantic moment they finally open it on Christmas morning, they may or may not remember to thank the gift giver first. So this is the story that straddles the gratitude of Thanksgiving week and the building anticipation of Christmas that the start of the season brings today. Jeremy and I are living through a higher stakes roller coaster of anticipation right now. So we prayed about becoming parents for many, many years. And finally, last Monday, the last of the paperwork was done for us to foster and adopt through the state. So we have just a few more weeks of waiting. And some friends that we met in our training class received their first call this past week. And they went and they picked up a 2-day-old baby girl from the hospital. And they're starting the process of adopting her. And my friend is 45, and she was explaining that after years of anticipating and dreaming about this, it's really hard to describe the joy that she felt in the moment she met the baby last weekend. And I can imagine that when the time comes for us, gratitude will probably be one of the many dozens of feelings that I have in that moment, but it might not be at the forefront enough for me to remember to thank God first. And I felt convicted about that this past week because I have a read through the Bible in a year app. And one of the passages was the story of Hannah, who you might remember as Samuel's mother. She offers her child in service to God without hesitating for even a moment, just out of pure gratitude for finally having the child that she had long waited for. And so I hope, like Hannah, I respond with gratitude first, but I can really understand the wave of very complex emotions that the 9 men healed of leprosy must have felt in that moment. I think it's hard for us to imagine today the pain that they faced constantly, both from the emotional strain of living as outcast and the physical pain that the disease can cause. And so it's not surprising that this story is only told in one gospel, the Gospel of Luke. And Luke was a physician and a foreigner who knew what it felt like to be on the fringes of society. So sufferers of leprosy stayed hidden away at this time because contagious bacteria causes discolored skin lesions, and then those cause nerve damage and numbness that can lead to injury because a person with leprosy might not feel or notice a cut or a scrape or a burn until it was too late. And they had an infection in antiquity, which was never good news. Repeated injuries to their hands and their feet often led to no longer being able to use them at all. And the skin sores and the disfigurement made it very, very obvious to everyone that that person had leprosy, which terrified those who saw the marks of the disease and prevented them from living among other people in an even remotely normal way. I think it's hard to imagine how difficult it was for them to live that isolated. Archaeologists tell us that these lepers would have lived in a cave that they really never left, and food and water would have been passed in through a hole to minimize contact. So they slept, they ate, and they hoped against hope that one day their misery might somehow end. And we hear Jesus happens to walk by this cave, but they don't see him. They just hear feet. So did they sense something in the air, the holiness of his presence? Or was it just that they were desperately calling out to anybody they heard passing by above them, hoping that someone would show them some kind of mercy or help? And when Jesus does show them mercy and offer them healing, I imagine the strength it took for them to emerge from the darkness and isolation of that cave, where they knew they'd have to step into the light, where everyone might see the toll that the disease had taken. So it's no wonder that Jesus is so moved by their plea, their desperate plea for healing and for cleansing, even knowing, as he did, that only one of them would return with thanksgiving. We read that the other 9 of them rush off to show themselves to the priest, which, to be fair, is what Jesus told them to do. But they never return. And they miss an opportunity for a deeper spiritual response and a closer connection to Jesus. Being able to finally enter the temple again was one of the only things they could think about doing first, because they believed the temple was where they experienced closeness to God. But in his immediate gratitude, the bond truly deepens between God and the Samaritan. And it's interesting when you consider that the one Samaritan in the group was the outcast among outcasts, because there was so much racial animosity between the Jewish people and people from Samaria. But once again, we see a beautiful example of God's inclusive, barrier-breaking love for all of us. And it's the Samaritan man's return, and not the 9 Jewish men, that leads to a complete healing in God's eyes, both physically and spiritually. But I wonder, besides their joy-induced forgetfulness to return to Jesus, why is it that only one returned? Is true gratitude really such a rarity? And maybe in a way it is. Gratitude is one of the most complicated and neglected emotions that humans have. Partly because most people just don't like to think of themselves as indebted or vulnerable. We would rather see our good fortune or our success as our own doing. But expressing true gratitude means admitting our dependence on other people and admitting our vulnerability. More so, for most people, expressing gratitude might feel good in a fleeting way for a minute, especially if it's not true, sincere gratitude. But if we're honest, expressing gratitude can also be uncomfortable for a lot of us. And it can also feel uncomfortable to be the recipient of someone else's gratitude, even if it's hard to put our finger on exactly why that is. But what's interesting here is Jesus clearly doesn't feel uncomfortable receiving gratitude, and in fact, he expects it. I think Jesus models giving and receiving gratitude for us biblically because it doesn't always come easily, and it takes practice and intention. So there's an interesting book called A Simple Act of Gratitude, which was written by a man who feels his life is falling apart at the time. His business is completely failing, and his relationship with the people that he loves has become very strained. So he decides he's going to write one genuinely very sincere thank you note every day for the next 365 days. And as he keeps up this practice, he realizes that he does have a lot to be grateful for, despite what was going on in his life at the time. And he said that before he started this project, he realized that he had a tendency to really notice the 9 bad things that happened to him in the course of a day and neglect to notice the one good one. Jesus knows that being able to truly express gratitude makes us better, happier people who keep a more positive perspective on life. And Jesus wants that for all 10 of the lepers. And on the face of it, it seems Jesus is angry that the other 9 did not return. But I think it's equally possible to interpret his response as sadness because he feels they're missing out, and rightly so. The other 9 were so close to complete healing and to deep, true relationship with him, but they couldn't quite take that extra, very vulnerable step of admitting that they were very indebted to Jesus, who had just changed their lives. As we enter this season, I invite you to consider the times and places in your life where Jesus has shown up and called out to us from the darkness that surrounded us, because those are the places and the moments where we're most able to connect with him. Amen.